Welcome to this explainer. Right now, the United States and China are navigating what has to be one of the absolute most complex geopolitical environments in recent memory. And honestly, for anyone tracking global stability, understanding exactly what's happening between these two powers isn't just interesting, it's absolutely crucial. Today, we're focusing squarely on the July 22nd diplomatic meetings that took place in Manila. And as we dig into the evidence, we really need to ask ourselves, did these talks actually create a substantive pathway toward a late September presidential summit, or were they merely a tactical move to just keep the relationship from completely deteriorating amid some really intense economic and security disputes? In this explainer, we're going to keep it strictly to the data, the verified timelines, and the official statements to figure out what actually happened.
Okay, let's dive right in. Here's a quick look at our agenda. First, we'll cover the Manila meeting itself. Second, the coordinated diplomatic preparations. Third, economic and trade deliverables. Fourth, regional security and friction. And finally, we'll weigh it all out: progress or tactical stabilization.
And that really brings us to the core question of our entire explainer. Did the Manila talks clear the path for a September presidential summit, or were they just a tactical maneuver to keep relations from collapsing? You see, in the world of international affairs, it is incredibly easy to confuse diplomatic meetings with an actual end to strategic rivalry. So we're going to rely purely on the evidence to weigh these two competing interpretations without predetermining a single thing.
All right. Let's get right into Section 1, the Manila meeting.
Okay, so here are the verified records. On July 22, 2026, U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio and Chinese Foreign Minister Wang held a 90-minute bilateral meeting in Metro Manila. This was happening right on the margins of the ASEAN Foreign Ministers meeting. Now, the main objective on the table was managing their bilateral differences and discussing preparations for a possible late September visit by Chinese President Xi Jinping to Washington, D.C. But I want to be extremely precise about this point. The evidence shows that this summit remains strictly proposed. It is not scheduled. Formal acceptance hasn't been confirmed by either government just yet.
And listen to the specific phrasing Secretary Rubio used here. He explicitly noted the goal was to lay the groundwork for a very positive visit. That right there is procedural preparation. It's the diplomatic machinery turning at the ministerial level, focusing on managing those profound differences rather than announcing finalized binding agreements. So while both delegations called the engagement constructive, we have to make that vital distinction between preparing for a meeting and actually resolving deep structural disputes.
Which takes us smoothly into Section 2, coordinated diplomatic preparations.
This timeline brilliantly illustrates how the Manila meeting absolutely does not exist in a vacuum. Check out this fast-moving geopolitical sequence. May 2026, President Trump makes a state visit to Beijing. Then, June 2nd, the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative formally opens a public comment process for a proposed Board of Trade. Fast forward to July 20th, regional friction suddenly spikes with a maritime incident at the Second Thomas Shoal. And then literally just 2 days later, July 22nd, key diplomatic meetings take place. Seeing the chronology like this really helps us understand how diplomatic engagement is happening right alongside escalating security competition.
And adding another layer to that sequence, the State Department's public schedule showed that on the exact same day Secretary Rubio was meeting with Minister Wang in Manila, U.S. Deputy Secretary of State Christopher Landau and Chinese Executive Vice Foreign Minister Ma Zhao were scheduled to meet over in Washington, D.C. Now, that strongly suggests a highly coordinated, synchronized bureaucratic effort across multiple levels of government. But we have to stop short of claiming any final agreements were actually reached in these parallel meetings. The evidence only points to sustained institutional engagement.
Let's move on to Section 3, economic and trade deliverables.
We really need to look at the administrative mechanisms currently under review. The proposed Board of Trade process kicked off with initial discussions during that May 2026 Beijing state visit. Then Step 2 hits on June 2nd, when the USTR formally opened a public comment process. But pay close attention to the third step. The exact scope and eligible tariff modifications remain entirely unresolved. The crucial takeaway for us here is that this Board of Trade is currently a proposed mechanism. It's actively in the public comment phase. This is an ongoing administrative review, definitely not an implemented trade agreement.
Now, this whole economic backdrop is contextualized perfectly by a single number: 0. While diplomats were busy discussing trade boards, international customs reports coming out in July revealed that China exported 0 shipments of the metal gallium or specific heavy rare earth elements like dysprosium to Japan during the single month of June. And these materials are absolutely critical for high-tech manufacturing.
Now, it's essential we read this data accurately. This is a single-month data point that illustrates significant supply chain friction. It doesn't independently prove a permanent formal state embargo policy, but man, it clearly demonstrates the intense economic pressures sitting right beneath the surface of these talks.
And that perfectly transitions us to Section 4, Regional Security and Friction.
Now, what's really interesting is how this dynamic captures the volatile reality in the South China Sea, which massively complicates the diplomatic track. On July 20th, a physical altercation occurred at the Second Thomas Shoal. We have to impartially look at the conflicting claims here. The Philippine government alleges that Chinese Coast Guard personnel struck a Filipino sailor with a wooden baton. On the flip side, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs disputes this entirely, alleging that Philippine vessels deliberately rammed a Chinese law enforcement boat. We are presenting these side by side strictly as disputed primary source allegations. We're enforcing total neutrality here without establishing either account as a verified fact.
Concurrently, we are seeing major shifts in the U.S. security posture in the Indo-Pacific. On July 15th, the U.S. Coast Guard officially announced they were transitioning their expeditionary cutter squadron over to the Western Pacific to conduct maritime security operations. And just to put the scale of that deployment into perspective, the defense specialist publication Jane's Defense reports that this squadron consists of 6 cutters operating out of Singapore and Subic Bay. So this absolutely confirms that both nations are continuing to assert their established security postures even while diplomatic engagement is ongoing.
But beyond regional security, there's also a massive amount of domestic political noise surrounding these talks. The backdrop to these meetings actually includes highly public, heavily disputed political allegations regarding 220 million U.S. voter files. Now, as focused learners, we must strictly separate the verified diplomatic progress from unproven claims circulating out there in the political sphere. So let's break down this election data dispute neutrally. On the U.S. side, President Trump publicly alleged that China illicitly acquired 220 million U.S. voter files. On the Chinese side, the government in Beijing officially and formally denied the allegations, labeling them a malicious smear and a fabrication. Now, just for some expert context, independent election security experts have pointed out that state voter registration files are largely matters of public record anyway, and previous intelligence assessments found absolutely no technical alteration of the voting process itself. But the geopolitical reality is simply that this dispute was dominating the headlines just days before the Manila talks kicked off.
Yet interestingly, Secretary Rubio publicly confirmed he deliberately did not raise these election interference allegations during his 90-minute meeting with Minister Wang. Isolating this highly charged political dispute from the Manila agenda? Well, that aligns perfectly with a tactical approach. It demonstrates a very calculated prioritization of near-term trade dialogue and summit groundwork over immediate domestic political disputes.
And that brings us to our final section, Section 5, Progress or Tactical Stabilization.
Okay, let's weigh the evidence and build our final assessment. If we view this through the lens of tactical stabilization, these meetings prevent broader bilateral collapse, they prioritize near-term dialogue, and they essentially manage rather than resolve the rivalry. But if we look at limited substantive progress, while these talks do identify actionable deliverables, they clearly synchronize diplomatic efforts in D.C. and Manila, and they actively move proposed mechanisms, like the Board of Trade, toward implementation. So the evidence actually suggests that both are true to an extent. The engagement currently represents high-level crisis management. It's aiming for incremental, localized deliverables rather than some grand resolution of their underlying strategic disputes.
But before we draw our final conclusion, we absolutely have to outline the unresolved variables. A durable agreement is simply not yet demonstrated, and that's because of these pending conditions. As of right now, we are still waiting for formal Chinese acceptance of the summit. The exact date and diplomatic format remain unconfirmed. The final scope of the USTR Board of Trade review is still pending the end of its public comment period. And crucially, the trajectory of the tensions in the South China Sea could at literally any point complicate this fragile diplomatic track. For anyone tracking global markets or international security, these are the key metrics you need to watch.
The Manila talks undoubtedly succeeded in preserving the diplomatic pathway to a possible Washington summit, but the structural foundations required for substantive agreements, those remain firmly under development. So, I'll leave you with this final thought to chew on. As the diplomatic pathway remains open, will these procedural steps actually mature into a substantive September agreement, or are they merely pausing an inevitable strategic collision? Keep a close eye on those unresolved variables, because they are going to dictate exactly what happens next. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.